In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a login system using object-oriented PHP programming. Now, before we get started, I do want to mention that this is not an HTML and CSS tutorial, which makes sense since we're doing object-oriented PHP. But if you want to have the HTML and CSS, you can go to my Patreon and get it from there. Just know that it isn't necessary to have my specific HTML and CSS. A login system like the one we're making in this video is going to work no matter how your website looks like. So you could just make something very basic or maybe have a website beforehand. It's going to work for every sort of website. I also want to mention that this is going to be a basic login system that you can implement into your own website. So if you want to add extra security to it, like for example, user roles inside a database, or if you want to add extra error handlers, it is not a perfect login system because otherwise the videos would be very long. But it is a very good start if you want to have a login system that you can then implement into your website and then make adjustments to it. So that is what we're going to be building in this episode here. But I will go ahead and leave links to things that you might want to consider in the description of the video. So if any of you have anything else to add to that list, just go ahead and write it in the comments and I'll go ahead and include that inside my description as well. So we have this small library of different places we can go if you want extra security and learn about extra security when it comes to PHP. Now, just to mention it, since I know I will get asked about this, we will be using object-oriented PHP, and we're also going to be using PDO in order to connect to the database. Regarding PDO, I get a lot of people coming to my procedural PHP video telling me that, oh, you should be using PDO, that's so much better. But something that people don't seem to know is that PDO is for object-oriented PHP. So in this example here, it would work. But when it comes to procedural PHP, we don't use PDO. We use something called MySQLi. So for people who are a little bit confused about this, MySQLi works for procedural. And for when it comes to object-oriented PHP, we use MySQLi or PDO. And I just want to mention that PDO isn't inherently better than MySQLi. It really depends on what exactly you're working with when it comes to databases and what exactly you're trying to build. So I will go ahead and leave a link in the description for a place where you can see the comparison to MySQLi and PDO if you want to see that. Either way, as you can see in front of me here, I do have a very basic website, and this is exactly what we're going to be using for making our login system. Don't get fooled by the fact that it might look just a little bit pretty. This is all HTML and CSS, and the only thing that works on this website is the sign up form and the login form down at the bottom. Now, just to kind of show you what exactly we're going to be making, what I could do is I could sign someone up, which I have done. I have a couple of users inside my database. Trust me, it works. And once you've signed up, we can go into the login field over here and just sort of sign in with one of the users that we created. So crossing 123 is my password, login. And then you can see up in the corner, it changes from sign up and log in to crossing, which is the name of my user, and log out. So if I were to click log out, it logs me out, and then we go back to sign up and log in. Now, these two buttons up here don't work. I just wanted to have them up there so I could show you that we can change part of the website depending if we're logged in or logged out. So it will change to, the name of the user and log out once we're logged in. So now that you've seen the completed version that we're going to end up with, let me go ahead and close it down and focus on the one that we will be creating together. Now, like I said, you don't have to have a website ready. You just need to have the sign up form and the login form, which I'll show you in just a second how I made. So I'll go ahead and pull this out to the side, and I'm going to open up my text editor, which you can see over here. And as you can see inside the text editor, I have all the basic HTML that you should know by now how to make. And I also have a style sheet that styles my website, just to have something to look at. But all that doesn't matter. What do matter, however, is that we go down to the bottom. And as you can see, I have a very basic HTML section and then a basic section with my sign up form and my login form. So all you need to have on your website is basically the form for the sign up and the form for the login. So what I just highlighted here is all you need. Inside the sign up form, we will have an action that is going to be where we're going to send this data once we sign up as a user. And it's going to be sent to a page that is inside an includes folder that we haven't created yet. So none of this has been created. We will do that together. We're also going to be using a post method because we don't want to show the data once we send it. So once the user types in their username, their password, their repeated password, and their email address, we don't want it to be seen inside the URL, which is basically what we're doing with the post method. So as you can see, 4 inputs: text type, password type, and a text type for the different 4 pieces of information. If you want to include more, you can do that. Like I said, this is a basic login system you can use to implement into your own login system on a website. You don't need to have it spot on like I have it here. You can make adjustments to it if you want to. And then I also have a button at the bottom here that is just a basic submit type that has a name set to submit. And then it just says sign up. And then the login form is even simpler. We have a basic form that sends the user to another page called login.inc.php. We also want to do this using a post method. We also have just two inputs. So we have a text type called username and a password type called password. And of course they have names as well. So do double check that all the names in all the different inputs are there, because that is going to matter once we grab the data on the next page. And then I just have a basic button down here that is also a submit button. So that is all you need to have when it comes to HTML. You don't even need to have any CSS, just this HTML and the login system is going to work with all the HTML that you have. You may think I'm wasting a lot of time on this, but a lot of people actually get really confused if I don't tell them that they don't need to have the exact same HTML and CSS as me. Like they think that it's gonna break if they don't have everything that I have in front of me here. It's not, okay? You just need to have this form and this form. Then everything is going to work. So with that said, let's go ahead and go inside our root folder of our website. Now, right now I am inside my htdocs folder. So as you can see, I have my root folder in front of me here. I have a couple of different files. I have a image folder, which is just basically the images I'm using inside my website to make it look pretty. Again, you don't need to have this folder. It is purely to make my website look pretty. So I have a background image and I have something inside this square here. I also have a index page, which is called index.php. That is important. And I also have a style.css. What I'll do is I'll right click and I'll go ahead and say new folder. And I'm going to create a folder called includes. I also want to create a folder which is called classes. The includes folder is basically where we insert files that we don't actually see inside the website. So you know how you have like an index page and you have a contact page and a cases page where like the user can like click back and forth to see the pages on your website. That is not going to be that type of file. An includes file is a PHP document that only has a script in it that is going to run that the user will never see inside the website. The classes folder is going to contain files that are only containing classes we're going to be using in object-oriented PHP programming. So that is basically what that folder is there for, and it will make sense in a second once we do actually get into the text editor and start making these files. So going back inside the text editor, what I'll do is I'll go up and create a new file. And I'll just go ahead and save this one. And I'm going to save it inside my includes folder. I'm going to call this one signup.inc.php. Now, something very important to point out here that also seems to confuse a lot of people is that the .inc part of the name is just naming. .inc does nothing. You could also just go ahead and say you want to call it signup.inc if you want to do that. You could also call it signup-inc.php if you want to do that. It is just a way to name my files. So I know that this is going to be a file that is included inside my includes folder. If I were to make this a file that should be inside the classes folder, I will call this one signup.classes.php. Okay, so don't get confused about it. It's just a naming convention that I have. I'm going to say .inc.php. And I'm going to save it inside my includes folder. Now that I've done that, I'm also going to create one for the login system. So I'm going to open up a new file and I'm going to save this one inside my includes folder as well. And I'm going to call this one login.inc.php. Just like so. Now, these two files are going to be what we are going to send our data to once we click this sign up or the login button inside our login and sign up forms. So once we send that data somewhere, it is going to end up in here. Then we'll grab the data, and then we'll do whatever code we need to do using PHP, using the classes we're going to build in a couple of minutes from now. So it's just basically files that handles the data that we send and then use them inside the classes that we're going to be building together. So the first thing we need to do is we need to check if we actually accessed this file or this page using the submit button or the sign up button inside the form, because it is possible to go inside the URL of the website and just type in the path for this file, but we don't want people to access the file using the URL. We want them to actually hit the submit button or the sign up button and get to this file the proper way. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up the PHP tags. We're not going to include the closing tags, by the way. We don't have to do that if we're doing a pure PHP file. Then I'm going to run a if statement that is just simply going to go in and check if we have a submit button set. So I want to run an isSet PHP built-in method, which is going to go in and say, okay, so whatever's inside the parentheses, we need to check for that. If that doesn't exist, then we don't want to run the code in here. So what I want to check for is if we have a $_post method, which is a super global that we have inside PHP. And I want to go ahead and check for something called a submit, because that is what we gave the name for our button inside our form. So as you can see, we have the name set to submit and the name to submit down here. So that is what we're checking for. And I'll go ahead and grab the data that we send over from the form. So I want to say we have a variable called UID that is equal to, we can actually copy this up here, $_post. Then we just want to make sure we grab the user ID or the UID from the form. Again, the name inside the post method is going to be the exact same name that we had inside our name tag when it came to the HTML. That is why those name tags are so important, otherwise we can't grab the data. Paste down 4 times because I sent over 4 pieces of data, and I'm going to change them to whatever they were called. So PWD for the password, PWD repeat, and then the last one is going to be email. So now these variables are going to contain the different data from the form. So in order for you to understand this next part without confusing you too much, if this is your first time making something like a login system using object-oriented PHP, we're going to go ahead and tag or write some comments for this. So this is going to be grabbing the data, just so we know what this does. Go down below here, instantiate signup controller class. And then this one is going to be called running error handlers and user signup. And then the last comment is going to be going back to front page. We're going to be inserting a little bit of PHP code in between each of these nodes. And once we have all of these filled in, we're going to have a complete sign-up system. And don't worry too much if you don't understand explanations of the different comments. I will go through them when we get to them. So in this first part, we're going to talk about instantiating a sign-up controller class, which basically means that we're going to be creating a object based off of a class that we haven't created yet. And inside that class, we're going to have all the different properties and methods that is going to allow for us to log in the user into the website or sign them up into the website. And that now means that we have to create a new document, and I'm going to save it inside my classes folder, and I'm going to call it signup.classes.php. And then I also want to create a new file, and I want to save it the same place, and I want to save this one as signup-controller, or just CONTR.classes.php. So now inside these 2 files, we're going to be creating 2 classes. So inside the signup.classes.php, we're going to do all the database related stuff. So if I want to run a query inside the database using PHP, I do that inside the class inside this document here. If I want to change something inside the database, then I want to do it using the signup controller class that we have in here, just so we have a little bit of separation of tasks that we have when it comes to object-oriented PHP. So let's go ahead and start inside the signup controller, since that makes more logical sense when it comes to like the chronological order in which we're going to be using the code inside the classes. So what I'll do inside my signup-controller class is I'm going to say I want to start up some PHP code, and I want to create a class, and I want to call this one signup controller with these particular capitalized letters as well. Then we're going to say curly brackets, and then all the code for the class is going to be in here. So all the properties and all the methods, which is basically, if I had to put it to someone who hasn't done object-oriented PHP before, it basically means that we're creating variables and we're creating functions inside this class here, but we don't call them variables and functions. We call them properties and methods instead, because they're part of an object. So to start with, let's go ahead and create the properties and the constructor that is going to be part of this class here once we instantiate it inside the signup.inc.php file. Because remember, I said we had to instantiate this particular class. So we need to have the properties and a constructor to assign the data that we have up here to the different properties inside the class. So going back inside our signup-controller and then going into the controller class, we're going to create a property, and I'm going to go ahead and call this one UID, and I'm going to just go ahead and set this one as private. Then I'm going to copy it, paste it down 4 times because we have 4 pieces of data. We have the username, we have the password, we have the password repeat, and we also have a email. Now regarding the protection level that I decided on, which is calling it private, because we could call it private, protected, or public, a good rule of thumb is to make your data inside classes the least amount of accessible if it doesn't have to be. So right now the signup controller is the only thing that is going to access these properties. So unless we get to a point where other classes need to access them without extending to this particular class, let's just keep them private for now. Next, I'm going to create a constructor. So I'm going to create a public function __ construct parentheses curly brackets. And then we want to grab the data that the user submitted using the signup form and assign them to these properties in here. That is basically what we're doing with a constructor. So when we're instantiating the class and creating an object, we want to make sure that all these different properties have assigned something to them, which is going to be the data from the user. So inside the construct parentheses, I'm just going to include my variable UID, or the property UID, I should call it, variable PWD and PWD repeat email, like so. And then inside the constructor, we want to actually grab the data we get from the user and assign it to the properties. Now, I just want to point something out, which some people might get confused about. The variables inside the parentheses are not these variables up here, okay? These variables are the properties inside the class. These variables are the data we grab from the user. So now we need to say that these variables up here, or these properties, are equal to the data from the user once we actually create this object, okay? So inside the constructor, I'm going to say that we have variable this, and then we want to point to this property. This is how we point to properties and methods, by the way. We reference to this class and this property inside this class, okay? And then we want to set this one equal to variable UID, which is the data the user submits. So I copy this, paste it down 3 more times, then I just simply change the names. Just to point it out, because like I said, some people might get confused, I could call this one email address and then, change it down here, and this would do the exact same thing. Because like I said, this and this are not the same thing. And this is basically all we had to do with the constructor inside this class here. So now what we can actually do is, if I were to go inside my signup.inc.php file, go down below my comment, I can actually instantiate my class and create an object. I know some people might be a little bit confused about what exactly we're doing with these classes. If you're completely new to object-oriented PHP, just follow along for now and you will understand everything in time. So in here, I want to make sure that I actually link to these classes up here. So I want to make sure we include and then have the classes included. So we have a classes, actually we need to go back one folder, because we're inside the includes folder right now. So we need to go back to the root directory and then inside the classes folder. So we need to go back one, go into the classes folder, and then grab the file called signup.classes.php. And then we want to copy this line, go down below, and then we want to make sure we also grab the signup-controller. So now that we included these classes, I'm going to go ahead and instantiate the controller class by saying I want to create a object. So I'm going to create a variable and I'm going to call this one signup, just something very basic. And I'm going to set this one equal to new signup controller parentheses semicolon. And now I'm basically instantiating the class. I'm creating an object from this class. And I also want to make sure I pass in the data that the user sent us, because that is going to be what we use the constructor for inside the class to convert to the properties inside the class. So we're going to make sure we assign these. We could actually just go inside here, inside the class, just copy and paste it in. That is a little bit faster, don't you think? There we go. So now that we're at this point, what we want to do is we want to go inside the signup controller, and any sort of error handling that we want to have inside our website when it comes to the signup form is going to be a separate method inside this particular class here. So if I want to make sure the username is a correct username type, or the email is a correct email type, if I want to double check that the password and the repeated password are the same, these type of error handlers is what we're going to be doing in here. And I'm not going to be doing all the different ones that exist on the internet, because that would make this video quite long. But you can go ahead and just include more if you want to have more included. For now, we're just going to focus on the ones that I have prepared for this lesson here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I want to make sure I want to check if there was any empty inputs when the user submitted the form. So if I did submit my sign up form over here, but I left, let's say, the username empty, then I want to make sure I grab that and say, oh, wait a second, you didn't type in all the different data. And then I want to throw an error message to say, hey, you need to fill in all the fields, otherwise you can't sign up. So we want to do that using a method. So I'm going to create a private function, which is technically a method since we're creating it inside a class. And I want to call it something like empty input, parentheses, curly brackets. Now, basically what I'm going to do with all these different error handlers is I just want to return a true or false statement. If an input was not filled out, I want to return as false. If everything was filled out correctly, I want to return it as true. So I'm going to start out by creating a variable, and I'm going to call this one result, just so we have an empty variable that we can insert the true or false statement into later on. Then I want to go below and I want to run a if statement, and I want to make sure that inside this if statement, we check if these inputs are empty. So now what I want to do is I want to check if these properties inside the class are empty or if they're not empty, because remember, we assigned the properties to the data the user submitted. So if the user didn't submit data, then there's no data inside one of these properties, right? So what I want to do inside the if statement is I want to run a empty built-in PHP function, and I want to say if this particular property called UID is empty, then it's going to run whatever code is inside the curly brackets. But we actually have 4 of these, so we want to do this 4 times. So I'm going to copy, and I want to say or something else, so we have all the different data types. So we have for the UID, we have for the password repeat, and the email. I'm just going to go ahead and make sure we can see this on multiple lines, because it kind of cuts out in the edge here, and I don't want to do that. So it jumps down to the next line now if I get too far out. Could actually slide it over a little bit. There we go. So if any of these different properties are empty, we want to assign result to false. And then below here, we want to say else, curly brackets, result is going to be equal to true. And then at the very end here, we also want to make sure we return the data. So we want to return variable results, like so. And that is basically how we check for empty inputs. Now, right now, it is actually not checking for it, but we do have the method ready we can call upon in order to check for the inputs being empty. So what I want to do is I want to say, do I have any other sort of error handlers I might want to use here? And I do actually also have one to check if the username is a valid username type. And as you can see, I just copy pasted from my notes here. This method here does basically the exact same thing as this method we just created together up here. The only difference is that I'm not checking for empty fields. I'm instead checking if certain characters exist inside the username, because I only want to allow these characters inside the username. And again, the preg match function is something you can look up online if you want to see what exactly it does. It basically just checks a string for a particular set of characters. And if something that is not included inside this preg match function, like let's say a exclamation mark or a $sign or something that we don't want to have included inside the username, then it's going to throw an error. So inside the preg match, we're checking for these characters, and we want to check the username with these characters here. And again, we're referencing to the property inside our class and not, the variable called UID. And it just so happens we also have one built into PHP that checks for email addresses being the right kind of email addresses. So I'm just going to paste it in here, and as you can see, it is basically a copy paste of all the other methods we just have up here. The only difference is that inside the if statement, I'm not checking for an empty field, and I'm not checking for the preg match function, but instead I'm using a built-in method into PHP. And with this one, I'm basically just going in and saying that this email property that we have inside the class should be this type of email address. Filter _validate _email is just a default built into PHP way to validate an email address. So, this particular function here is how you would validate an email address without having to write your own custom code. And then because we also have a password and a password repeat inside our form, we do want to make sure that these two are the same, right? Because otherwise it wouldn't make sense to have them write the password twice. So going down to the bottom here, I'm also going to create a method that is called password match. And this one is going to do the exact same thing as the previous methods, except inside the if statement, we're now checking if password is the same as password repeat. Very basic stuff. Now there is one more error handler that we need to run, but we can't do it just quite yet, because I want to check if the username or the email exists inside the database already. So if I signed up using crossing as my username, or I have a particular email address I used, then I don't want to have another user sign up with the same email address or the same username. And that is something we can't do until we start writing code inside our database class, which is going to be the model class that we haven't set up yet. But now, before we can set up the model class, which like I said, connects to the database, we need to make sure we have a database connection that we can actually grab onto in order to actually run the SQL statements inside the database. So what we will need to do is we'll need to create a new file. I'll save it, and I'll make sure to save it inside my classes folder. I'm going to call this one dbh.classes.php. And this is going to be my database class that is just simply going to open up a database connection to our database. So just to make this a lot faster, I'm going to go to my controller class, copy everything, paste it in, and delete all the methods we just talked about. So all the way up till here. Actually, we don't need these either. So let's just go ahead and delete these as well. And I'm going to rename the class as dbh with a big D. Inside my class here, I'm going to say I have a private function. And I'm going to call this one connects. And this is basically just a method inside our dbh class here. Now do notice that we did not have to go in, just like with our previous class, and create properties. And we don't have to create a constructor, because we're not actually going to be creating an object based off this class here. We're just going to create a class that has a very basic method inside of it that can connect to the database, and then we'll refer to this method afterwards. So inside this method, I want to make sure that first of all, we have the proper information for our database. So I'm going to go ahead and run a try catch, which looks like this. It's just basically, it's going to try to run this code up here, and if there is an error, it's going to catch the error and do the error instead. In my example here, I want to check for a PDO exception type error, and I want to assign that error message to variable e, which is just a default naming convention we use when it comes to try catch methods inside PHP. So variable e is fine for now. Inside my try block, I'm going to go ahead and just say, well, right now I have a username and a password for my database, right? So I'm going to say I have a variable called username. I'm going to assign it equal to root. And I also have a password. And I want to assign this one equal to nothing. And again, this is going to change depending on what kind of localhost server you're using. Some people need to write root both places. But if you're using XAMPP like I am, which is this one right here, and you just have everything set as a default, you didn't change anything, it should just be root and then nothing for your password. And then I want to actually run a connection. So I want to say here that I have a variable, and I want to call this one dbh because this is my database handler. I want to set this one equal to new PDO parentheses semicolon. And then inside the parentheses, we're going to be, running the information that it needs in order to connect to the proper database. So I'm going to say single quotes, and I'm going to say that this is a MySQL type database because we're using phpMyAdmin. And I want to say that the host is going to be localhost because that's what I'm using right now since I'm using XAMPP, semicolon. And then I want to say my database name is going to be equal to whatever name I'm going to pick inside the database once we get to it. So for now, let's go ahead and call this one OOP login, for example. So once we actually get to create a database inside our phpMyAdmin, that is going to be the name we're going to create for it. And then afterwards, I want to include my username and my password. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy them from up here. So I have a username, and I also have a password. And then below here, I just simply want to say I want to return my database handler, because once we actually call on this method here, it should return the database connection. Now inside the catch block down here, I want to run whatever code I want to run if I get an error when it comes to connecting to the database. And I do have some stuff from my notes here. I just simply print out error, and then I want to refer to the error message that we have up here. So if we get an error, it will be assigned to variable e, and I want to grab the message that variable e has gotten, and then I just simply run the message. So this is just going to give us a error message, and then it's going to kill the connection afterwards. And with this, we now have a database connection that we can refer to. So going back inside our signup.classes.php, we can now start creating the necessary code that needs to be run inside the database that we haven't created yet. So let's go ahead and go inside our browser and go inside phpMyAdmin. You should know how to access this by now. And go inside databases. And then I'm going to create a new one that has the exact same name as the one we gave inside our DBH method. So I'm going to just paste it in, OOP login, create. And then I want to go ahead and create a table inside this database, because right now we don't have any place to insert our user once we actually create them inside the website. So make sure you have OOP login selected on the side. Go up to SQL. Let me actually go ahead and zoom in and drag this out so you can actually see. Go inside the SQL tab, and then we're just simply going to create a create table query that is going to create a table called users. Then we're going to assign a couple of different columns inside our database table. The first one is going to be users_ID, which is just the basic ID we need to have for all tables inside our database. I made this one a integer data type, and I also made sure to auto increment it. So whenever we create a new user, it's just automatically going to increase the number by 1 each time. So each user has a unique ID inside the database. This is also going to be the primary key for this particular user whenever I create one. And it's going to be not null. Then I created another column that is going to be the user's UID, which is the username. And this one is going to be a tiny text type, not null. Then we have the user's password, which is going to be the one they submit. And this one is going to be a long text type, not null. And then finally, we have the user's email. And this is going to be tiny text, not null. Make sure you don't have a comma at the end here, because I see a lot of people get this error message. If it's a last entry, don't put a comma behind there. Now we're going to just say go. And it's going to run the table inside our database. And as you can see inside our OOP login over here, we now have a table called users. Now there's no data inside of it, so we can't see anything inside of it right now, but we will create some data once we do actually have a working sign-up system. So going back inside our signup.classes.php file, we're going to go ahead and create the class that is going to be for our database whenever we need to query something. So I'm going to just copy everything inside my signup-controller class and just paste it in. And then I want to delete all the different methods we have in here. And this is going to be including our properties and the constructor. We don't need to have those either. So now that we have this, let's go ahead and change the name so it doesn't say sign up controller, but it says sign up. And inside the class, we're going to be creating the methods that we're going to use in order to query into the database. Now, what we want to make sure we do here is we want to make sure we extend to our database class, because right now we want to make sure we can use this connection here, which means that we have to extend to that particular class. Otherwise, we can't use any properties or methods from within that class. So inside our class signup name, I'm going to write extends DBH, which is written with a capitalized D. And something we have to change as well is that right now we can't actually grab the data from inside the database class as long as this is set to private. So if we were to, instead of private, set it to protected, it now means that the database class can use these properties and methods, but if any class extends to this class, then they can use it as well. Now, the first thing I'm going to do inside the signup class is I want to make sure that I double check if the username or the password submitted by the user already exists inside the database. And we can do that simply by actually checking the database inside this class here, and then sending that result as a true or false statement back to the controller, so we can now do one of these error handlers that we have in here. So going inside the signup class, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a protected, because remember, we have to refer to this particular method from the controller, so this has to be protected. I want to run a protected function, which is actually a method, and I'm going to call this one check user, parentheses, curly brackets. Then I want to make sure that we check for, first of all, the username, so the UID, comma, and the email. Now, it is important to note here that these two variables are actually not variables. They are the properties from inside the controller class. So once we actually call on this method from within the controller class, we need to paste in the properties for these variables here. Again, if you're confused, it's going to make sense once we actually get around to do it. The first thing I want to do is I actually want to create a new statement, because we have to make sure we run a prepared statement when we query anything inside the database, because that is going to be more secure than just querying it without running a prepared statement. So I want to make sure that we have a variable statement, and I want to set it equal to this class and point to connect parentheses. And you may notice something here because we're actually referencing to the connect method from within our function, or the method we have inside the database handler. So this method inside our database connection is actually what we're referring to here. So we're grabbing the connection. Then I want to say with this connection, I want to run a SQL statement and query it inside the database. So I'm going to use a method called prepare, parentheses, semicolon. And then inside the parentheses here, we're going to write whatever SQL code we need to write to run inside the database. Now I just went ahead and pasted in from my notes here, but I will explain it. So basically what we're doing is we want to select users_UID, which is one of the columns from inside the users table, where users ID or the user's email is equal to something. So basically what we're doing is we're checking if the username from up here that the user submitted is equal to any username inside the database. And we're doing the same thing for the email address. So we're checking if there is an email address that exists inside the database that is the same as the one the user gave us. Then we want to make sure we actually know this by running this statement here. Oh, how nice, it started raining. Nothing like a little bit of ambient sounds while I'm teaching. And now basically with this, we have a prepared statement that we can now execute into the database and actually get a result from. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and say I have a if statement, because I want to actually make sure we also check if this one actually returns with an error message. So if the actual execution of the SQL statement fails, then I want to know about it. So inside the if statement, I just want to copy paste the statement. And I want to say that I want to point to a method called execute, parentheses. And inside this execute statement, we're going to insert the data that is going to replace the question marks up here, because I didn't actually address the question marks. Basically, when it comes to prepared statements, we can go in and assign question marks instead of actual data. So instead of doing this, we're assigning a question mark, and these act as a placeholder that we then later on can assign to this query. And the whole idea is that we can actually run the query into the database first, and then afterwards we can then submit the data that needs to be filled in. And in this sort of way, we can actually prevent SQL injection into our database because we separate the data from the query. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take the data and I'm going to assign it to the question marks. Now, since we have more than one piece of data, because right now we actually have a username and a password, we need to insert this as an array because, we have more than one piece of data, so it has to be an array. So what I'll do is I'll copy these, put them inside the array, and then I want to check if this one fails. So I want to check if it returns as a false statement, because this is actually going to be true or false depending on if it fails or if it succeeds. So if this one fails by putting an exclamation mark in front of it, then I want to not run the rest of the code. And the way we're going to do that is, first of all, I want to make sure I close off my statement. So I want to make sure this one is set equal to null. That is how we can actually just delete the statement entirely. And then I want to create a header function, which is going to send the user back to the front page with an error message. So as you can see, I simply sent the user back to the index page. And I did that using a error message called error is equal to statement failed. And that is going to be what the URL says back on the index page if this fails. And then the last thing is I want to exit this entire script. So I want to say exit, parentheses, semicolon. The next thing I want to do is I also want to run an if statement, and I want to check if we had any rows that returned from this query up here, because right now we're just checking if this particular statement failed executing into the database, but we haven't actually checked if we got any results back from the database. Now, some people will tell you that this statement up here is going to return as false if the user does not exist inside the database, but I've tested it and it does not. So you do need to check if you get any sort of rows returned from the database query, meaning if we had a result, then we actually grabbed the result, and if we grabbed anything, then this should actually be false. So the first thing I want to do is I want to create a result check variable. So $result check, just so we have it, so we can actually return the result later on as a true or false statement. Then inside the if statement, what I want to do is I want to grab the statement from up here. I want to point to a method called row count, parentheses. And this basically just tells us how many rows was returned from this query here. So if there was a user inside the database, it is most likely going to return at least one user from inside the database. So if this one is greater than 0, then we want to set $result equal to false. Else, I want to make sure that this one is going to set result check equal to true. And then of course at the end here we want to make sure we return our result check. So we say return result check. And this simple method here basically goes in and queries the database, finds out if the username or the email exists inside the database already. And if it does, we don't want to sign up this user here because the username or the email has already been taken. So this is going to return a true or false statement depending on this. So going back inside our controller, what I can do is I can just copy paste another one of these error handlers, go down a couple of lines, and instead of checking if the passwords match each other, I can actually go ahead and say I want to run this and point to a method from inside the signup form called check user parentheses. And then we need to make sure we insert the username and the email, because remember, we need to have a username and an email inside the parameters. So going back inside our controller, we want to make sure that we reference to these properties up here. So I'm just going to grab the UID. And I'm going to paste it in as the first parameter. And then for the second one, we're pasting in the email. And this is basically all the error handlers that I want to create for this particular system here. Of course, there's a lot more you could create. These are the ones that I just want to focus on. So now that we have all the error handlers, the last thing I want to do is I want to actually create a method that allows for us to sign up the user if none of these error handlers returns an error. So what I can do right underneath the constructor inside my controller class is I can go ahead and create another private function. And I'm going to call this one signup user. And I'm just going to go and delete everything we have in here. So inside the signup user method, I actually want to go in and I want to say if, for example, the first empty input. So I'm going to say this and point to empty inputs is equal to false. Then I want to run some sort of error message inside the curly brackets. So in this case here, I'm just going to copy paste. I'm just simply going to run a header statement that is going to send the user back to the front page with an error message inside the URL called empty input, which we can then use to output an error message inside our sign-up form inside the website. We also want to make sure we exit this entire script. So just write an exit statement. And now all you have to do is copy paste and do the exact same thing. So the next error handler is called invalid UID. We paste that in. If that is equal to false, it means that we now have a invalid username. So we can actually write that as the comment here. And we can just go ahead and write username as the error message inside the URL. And we're just going to copy paste this one more time. And we're going to do the exact same thing. So this time we have invalid email. That's the next one we have down here. Paste that in. And then we want to say invalid email. And then do the same thing here. We'll just write email inside the error message. And that's just how you're going to keep doing it. So I'll just go ahead and copy paste what I have here. We have two more error handlers. So I'm going to copy paste my password match and my UID taken check, which is the one that checks if the passwords are the same, and the one that checks if the user or the email already exist inside the database. So I can just sort of like copy my little comments, and you can also just sort of copy my error message inside the URL for both of these two. And now if we go through all of these and we don't catch any errors, we can actually sign up the user. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and say I want to reference to this class and a method called setUser. And now we haven't actually created this one yet. So let's go back inside our signup.classes.php, because this is where we interact with the database, remember. And at the very top here, I'm going to create another method. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy paste the one we have already. And I'm going to call this one setUser. Then I want to make sure that we have the username, we have the password, And we also have the email because we need those 3 things in order to sign up the user. And just to make sure the words don't go outside the screen here, I'm just going to go ahead and word wrap it so it jumps down. You can do that by going up to View and then going down to word wrap, or write Alt-Set for the shortcut there. So in order to sign up the user, we need to do a couple of things inside this method here. First of all, we need to change the statement inside the SQL statement here. So we're not trying to select something from the database, we're actually trying to input something into the database. So what we'll do instead is I'm going to go ahead and paste in what I have from my notes here, which is a basic insert statement. We insert into a database table called users, and then we want to include, first of all, the column names from inside that database, and then afterwards the values that are going to be inserted into those column names. And again, we wrote question marks because these are placeholders, because we're running a prepared statement. And afterwards, what we want to do is we don't want to execute this SQL statement just quite yet, because when it comes to database security, we need to make sure that we hash the password before inserting it. So I'm going to go ahead and do that below here. I'm going to say we have a variable called hashed pwd. Oh my god, this rain. The rain is all over the place. We're going to write password underscore hash, which is a built-in method into PHP that is going to allow for us to hash any sort of password or string that we might throw at it. So with this, I first of all need to tell it, okay, what exactly do we want to hash here? We want to hash the password that we have inside the constructor properties. And then we also want to make sure we include what kind of hashing method we want to use. Now, as a default, just write password underscore default, like so. And this is going to assign a very messy looking password to hashed password here that we're then going to unhash once we actually want to lock in the user. So we need to match these up against each other. So we're technically not unhashing, we're just like hashing again and then checking if they're the same, basically. So what I want to do now is inside my execute statement, which looks the exact same thing as the one we copy pasted, we want to make sure we include 3 pieces of data instead of 2. Oh, I can actually see we do need to make sure it says array. That is a typo. Also do it down with the other one. Make sure you do that. So we just want to copy, paste them in like so. But in this case here, we actually want to replace password with hashed password. Because remember, we want to insert the hashed version into the database. And then at the very end, we also want to make sure that we end off our statements, and then we can just delete everything else. And with this, we can actually go ahead, go back inside our controller, and then we need to insert the properties that we're going to pass on to set user, which is going to be these 3 pieces of data. Okay, so the username, password, email. So we're going to go ahead and say we have, first of all, let's go ahead and grab it up here, a username, which is a property. Then I also want to insert the password, so pwd, and the email. And you may not believe it, but this is actually all we need to have in order to sign up the user inside the website. Everything should be working now. So if I were to go back to my signup.inc.php file, which is the one that we actually send the data to once we submit the forms, we want to make sure we also include a database file, because right now we have the signup class and the signup controller class, but we also need to make sure we have the database class here. So dbh.classes.php. Otherwise, these other files down here can actually access these methods and properties from within the other classes. It is also important that you have the database file first, because the signup form needs to have something from within the database file. So that needs to be loaded first. And the signup controller needs to have methods from inside the signup class. So that needs to be run first. Okay, so this is important with the ordering. And once we have this, we can actually go down, and with this new object we created called signup, we can go ahead and reference to a method we created called signup user. And again, this is the exact same one that we have inside at the top here. So signup user, that is running all the different error handlers and also actually running the code at the very end. That is what we're running inside our signup.inc.php file here. And then the last thing we need is just to send the user back to the front page. So we're going to say we have a header file or a header function, and we want to send the user back with an error is equal to none message inside the URL to tell the user there was no error signing up. So with this, I can go and save it. Let's go inside our website and refresh. Now, before we continue, I did actually notice that I have 3 errors inside my code, and this is a very good time to talk about the fact that I'm getting a lot of comments underneath my PHP project videos from people who tells me that they copied my code exactly and they're getting error messages. 9 out of 10 times, it is because you made a typo or you wrote something wrong and you just didn't notice it, just like I did 3 times just now. So inside my code here, I first of all inside signup.inc.php want to double check that password repeat has a capitalized R. That is important. Also inside my signup controller class, I want to scroll down to my signup user method, and I want to make sure this one is not set to private. This one has to be public. Otherwise, we can't use it inside our signup.inc.php file, right? Otherwise, it can only be used inside the class. Also, going down to the bottom, I did not change the name of my last error handler. So I do want to make sure this one is called UID take and check. And do make sure this is the same name that you have when you go up to the error handlers inside our signup user function or the signup user method at the very last one here. Okay, make sure you have that. There is one more error that we need to make sure we fix because I have accidentally been leaving $signs in front of my properties, which should not be there. So let's go ahead and delete those. Whenever we have this pointing at a property, make sure there's no $sign. So it's fine here, it's fine up here. Here, we do need to remove them. Make sure we don't have them inside the empty checks. Also, we don't want to have them up here, inside the set user. And also, inside the actual constructor, we don't want to have $signs. Okay, and the last thing I just noticed here is that I don't actually extend my signup controller to my signup class, which we need to do as well. So we say extends to signup. And we also need to make sure we go inside UID take and check, which is inside our controller class, and make sure we check if this is not true inside the check user method that we're actually running inside the if statements. And with this, let's go ahead and go back inside the website and try and sign up. So I'll sign up as crossing, password 123, test@gmail, and sign up. And as you can see, we now get error is equal to none. So if I were to go back inside my database, you can actually see that by refreshing it, we now have a new database entry with a new user inside the database. So with all those errors fixed, I have some good news, which is the fact that right now we just did the hardest part of this entire login system, because the easiest part is actually locking people into the website, and the more complicated part is actually signing them up into the website. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and create the login part, which is much more simpler and much more fast to do. So I'm going to create a new document. I'm going to save it inside my classes folder, and I'm going to call this one login dash controller dot classes dot php. Then I'm going to copy paste my controller from inside the sign up form, copy it, paste, and I'm just going to delete all the different error handlers that we have down here at the bottom, except for the one that actually checks if we have any empty inputs. So I'm just going to delete everything else, and then I'm going to also delete the part where we check for password repeat and the email, because we don't need to have that. So we're just going to delete, so we only have the UID and the password. And we're also going to go and delete all the error handlers inside the signup user method that we have up here. So we're just going to delete them all except for the empty input check that we have up here. When it comes to the properties, we're also going to delete the last 2 because we don't need those. We just need to have the username and the password. And we're also going to delete the 2 inside the constructor. So we're just going to delete those. Make sure we also delete them from up inside the parentheses. And then we're going to rename the method from signup user to login user. And instead of signing the user up inside the website using the set user method we have down here, instead we're going to create a get user method. So we're just going to go ahead and change the name from set user to get user. And we're also going to go ahead and delete the email because we don't need to have that inside the parameter here. And with this, we now have everything we need to have inside our controller class. And of course, if you have any other error handlers that you want to check for, you can just go ahead and copy paste this one and include it inside the if statement, and then include them inside the login user method. But just for this tutorial here, this is everything we're going to have. So with that, we're going to create a new file, and I'm going to save this file inside my classes folder, and I'm going to save it as login.classes.php. And with this one, we're also going to go ahead and just copy paste from signupclasses.php. So we're just going to copy, paste it in, and we're just going to change the name from signup to login. And we do also need to go back to the controller class. We forgot to change these up here. So we want to say, instead of signup controller, this one is going to be called login controller. And then we want to extend to login, which is the one we just created up here. So with this created, we basically just need to create one method that is going to go in and lock in the user. It is going to be a little bit longer though than these that we have here. So it is probably going to be the same length of these two combined. But let's just go and delete the second one and just focus on the first one up here. So instead of set user, I'm going to change this one to get user. I'm also going to go ahead and delete the email from in here, because just like if we were to go back to the controller, you can see that right now we're just referencing to the UID and the password. So we need to make sure that that's the only two inside the parameters. I'm just going to go ahead and word wrap so we can see everything. The first thing we need to do is we need to go inside the database and just grab the user that the user is trying to sign up with the username, and grab the password from that user, because we need to check that password from the database with the password the user has tried to submit. So instead of doing an insert statement, we're just going to do a select statement. And this one is just going to select one column from inside the database called users_password from users, where the user's UID is equal to question mark and user's email is equal to question mark. And these question marks, again, are going to be placeholders that we're going to include a little bit later on. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete our password hash here. Then we want to make sure to execute the statement, and we don't want to execute 3 different parameters. We just need to have the password and the username. And again, this is just checking if we have any kind of errors when it comes to executing the statement inside the database. And once we've done this, we want to do the same thing where we go in and we check for how many columns or how many results are we getting from this query here. So I'm just going to copy paste, because this is something we have done before. Paste it in. So basically what we're doing here is we're checking if we have 0 results from the database, then we want to throw an error message, because we're trying to get the user now. So if we don't get the right user, then we're not going to be able to log in. So if we don't have any results from the query, we just simply say we want to end off our statement, exit the script, and return the user back to the front page with an error message. Afterwards, we then want to take the password, if we did actually have a result, and we want to take the password from the database and we want to match it with the one the user gave us. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to say we have a variable called pwd hashed, and we want to set it equal to the statement that we have up here. And we want to point to a method called fetch all, which is a built-in method into PHP. And then what we can do is we can say, okay, how do we want to return this data? Like, in what sort of shape or form do we want to have it? And in this case here, I want to say that we want to grab this as a associative array. So I'm going to say PDO : fetch _assoc, which is going to return it as an associative array. And yes, I do know that this is something that we can set when we do actually create the connection to the database up here. It is possible to create, different optional parameters for how we want to connect and return data. But for now, let's just go and do it directly inside this one statement here. Then with this, I'm going to go to the next line, and I want to say we want to check password. So we're going to take the 2 passwords and check against one another. So I want to say is equal to password _verify, which is a built-in method we have inside PHP. And the first parameter is going to be the password that the user has submitted. So we're just going to paste that in. And then we want to get the one from the database. Now in this case here, we're actually getting the data that we queried for inside a associative array. So what I want to do is I want to say that we have our password hashed. I want to paste it in. And we actually want to say that because this is a multi-dimensional array, that we want to go inside the first dimension of results. And remember, when it comes to programming, the first one is always going to start at 0, and then 1, and then 2, and it counts up that way. So we want to get the 0th index, is what we're calling it. And then we want to grab the associative array that has a name set to users_password. And this is the exact same name that we have as a column name inside the database. So if we were to go in we can actually see that the users have users_password here set to the name for that column. And this now means that check password is going to return as true or false. It's going to be true if these are actually the same passwords, and it's going to be false if they're not the same. So what we can do is we can run another if statement. I'm just going to copy the one we have up here, go below, paste it in. And instead of running this particular statement, I instead want to check if check password is equal to false, because that means that the passwords are not the same. So what we can do is we can then return another error message. This one is just going to be wrong password. And then we can say else if check password is equal to true, then I want to start locking in the user. And we do that first of all by actually going back up here, copying the statement with the SQL code. And the way we need to do that is actually by doing the exact same thing as we did up here. We're going to take the statement with the SQL code and we're going to prepare a new prepared statement. So we're going to go into the else if. I'm going to paste in my SQL statement here. But of course, this time we're going to check for something different. This time we're going to check for everything from users where the user has a username that is equal to what the user submitted, or the user's email inside the database is equal to what the user submitted. And the reason I have this included is because in some cases, some of you guys might want to allow the user to either log in using their username or their email address. And in this case here, we actually allow for both. So you can use either the username or the email address, which is kind of neat. It does confuse a little bit because we're going to have to use UID for both checking username and email, but this is how you would do it. And then of course, we also want to make sure we check for the password. So we have user's ID or user email, and we want to make sure the password is the same. So with this, we go below, and then we just simply run a execute statement. So I'm just going to copy it from up here, copy it below. But this time we have 3 parameters. So we want to check the username, the email, and the password. And like I said, the username is going to be the same when it comes to the email here, because the user is submitting either the email or the username, and no matter what the user submits, it's going to be inside UID. So that is going to be what we insert into both of these here. And then below, we can actually go ahead and lock in the user. So the way we do that is, first of all, I want to check, did we actually get any results from this database query? Because what if we actually run through all of this code, but the user wasn't actually returned to us? So what I can do is I can, again, just like before, do a row count. If it's not 0, then we want to continue and actually lock in the user. So underneath the row check, I want to say that I have a variable called user. I'm going to set it equal to the statement. So variable stmt. I'm going to point to fetch all, just like we did above, parentheses, semicolon. And of course, I also want to make sure I get this as an associative array. So we just want to copy what we have in here, like so. And then we just simply create a new session underscore start, parentheses, because we need to start a session before we can assign session variables into the, the session that we have going inside the website. So we need to start a session. And then I'm going to say we have a session superglobal. This one is called user ID. And I'm going to set this one equal to user, which is up here, which is the one that contains all the data from the database, user, and then the 0th index, just like we did above. And then we reference to whatever column inside the database we want to grab. So in this case here, I want to grab users ID or users underscore ID. And then I'm just going to go ahead and copy, paste, and then I want to do user UID. Like so. I'm just going to take the ending off statement down here. I'm just going to go ahead and move it inside what we have going here. So with this, all the classes when it comes to the login part should be working. So let's go back to login.inc.php, which is going to be the one we actually submit the data to when the user clicks submit on the login form. So I'm going to copy everything from within signup.inc.php, paste it into login.inc.php, and I'm just going to change some of the information in here. So we don't want to have password repeat and email. We don't want to have our signup classes, but we want to have login.classes, And the same thing for login controller. We also want to make sure we have the login controller when we create a new object down here. So login. Also make sure you delete the last two parameters inside of it as well. And then we of course want to change them inside our actual method down here that we're calling upon. So we're not calling for signup user, but login user. Then if we were to go inside our index page, which is where we actually have the form, we can do something really quick to test out if this is actually working inside the website. So if I were to go up to my navigation, this part right here is what you can see up inside the top right corner of my website. So what I can do is I can actually go ahead and with PHP say if I'm logged in, change this information into something else, which in my case here is going to be the name of my user that is logged in and also a logout button. So what I can do is I can actually go ahead and copy what I have in my notes here because this is actually very simple. So with this here, basically what I'm doing is I'm starting up my PHP tags and I'm saying that I have an if statement where I'm checking if I'm currently signed in and have a session ID running inside my session, then I want to have this navigation here showing. If I'm not logged in, then I want to have this navigation here showing. That's basically all we're doing here. Don't get confused by the fact that I'm opening and closing my PHP tags constantly. We could also, if we wanted to, remove all of this like so and just run regular PHP code. But the reason I'm not doing that is because I would actually need to echo all of my HTML code each time. So instead I'm opening the PHP and then I'm writing the PHP code that I need, which is right now an if statement with the opening bracket. Then I close the PHP, insert the HTML, open my PHP again, and then I close off the bracket. So this right here is an if statement. Okay, it's just done in a way so that I can actually write HTML without having to echo it out each time. And then afterwards, I just have a basic else statement that is going to say if I'm not logged in, then show the regular sign up and login button that I have up here as a default. So with this saved, we should technically have a working login system. Well, we also need to have a logout button. So let's go ahead and make that really quick. So I'll make a new document. This one is very easy to do. It takes literally 1 minute to do if I'm fast about it. So inside my includes, I'm going to save this one as logout.inc.php. And then I'm just simply going to open up my PHP code. I'm going to start a session. So session _start parentheses, because we need to start a session in order to destroy a session. So right now, if I'm logged into the website, I have a session running. So in order to destroy that, we need to start it up first. So I'm also going to copy paste 2 times. The second one is going to be session _unset to unset all the different session variables. And then the last one is going to be destroy. And then underneath here, we're just going to send the user back to the front page. And we can just do that by copying the header we have inside the signup.inc, the PHP file, and paste it in. With this, we should be done. So let's go ahead and go inside the website, refresh. I spoke too soon because there's actually one last thing we need to do. In every single page inside your website, you need to make sure there's a session running at the top of the page. Otherwise, you can't see whatever you need to see when the user's logged in. So at the top of our index page, I'm going to run some PHP tags, opening and closing, and I'm just going to go ahead and start my session at the top of my index page, like so. With this, we should now be done. So going inside the website, I'm going to refresh, and I did actually try to log myself in, so I am logged in, so I can just log myself out again. And now I can try and go down, log in as crossing, so crossing 1, 2, 3, log in. And now I can see I'm logged in as crossing, and we have a logout button instead. So I can click it, and then we log out again. And this is basically how we can create a login system using object-oriented PHP. And again, like I said at the beginning, it is meant as a starting thing where you need to like take this login system and tweak it in order to add extra security to it, or add extra error handlers, you know, so you can actually catch something like the password being too short or something. So this is how you can create a basic login system. I had way too many typos in this video, so I hope you could follow and it wasn't too confusing. I'll go ahead and leave notes so you can actually see what is going on whenever I do a typo. So, do what the note says on screen and not what I'm writing when I actually get to a typo. So with this, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys next time.